all discovered by one bankrupt farmer's desperate attempt to save his condemned property and the crumbling wall that would reveal America's most significant underground railroad operation, preserved beneath his flooded cellar for over 160 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The April rain pounded mercilessly against the weathered farmhouse as James Richardson descended the creaking wooden steps into what had become his worst nightmare. At 42, he never imagined he'd be fighting to keep the dilapidated family farm where he and his teenage son had hoped to build a better life after his wife's death from cancer 3 years earlier. But here he stood, ankle-deep in murky water that had been rising for 5 days, clutching a condemnation notice that gave him exactly 72 hours to make the root cellar habitable or watch the county declare their only remaining asset uninhabitable forever. The flooding had begun during the worst spring storm Pennsylvania had witnessed in decades. What should have been minor seepage during heavy rain had transformed into catastrophe when the region's century-old drainage system failed catastrophically, sending thousands of gallons of water cascading into the cellar of Oak Ridge Farm, a historic property built in 1851 that had weathered over 170 years of harsh Pennsylvania seasons but wasn't designed to withstand the infrastructure collapse that had overwhelmed their struggling rural community. James unfolded the crumpled condemnation notice from his pocket, reading it for the 20th time that morning. The bureaucratic language was cold and impersonal, reducing his family's legacy to a series of housing code violations and structural concerns. Chester County Housing Authority, property unsafe for habitation due to flooding damage, structural hazards, and potential foundation compromise. Final notice: compliance required within 72 hours or property will be condemned and seized. The weight of those words pressed down on James like the gray April sky outside. He surveyed the cellar that had once held so much promise, the space where he'd planned to cure meats and store vegetables from the farm's revival he'd dreamed about. Now it was a disaster zone filled with murky water that carried the detritus of their modest possessions. Floating tools, waterlogged furniture, and the scattered remains of the life they'd struggled to maintain. The irony was crushing. James had spent 18 years working the land, understanding historic agricultural properties better than most. He'd inherited this farm from his grandfather, a place where 5 generations of Richardsons had worked the soil. The drought of recent years, combined with crippling medical bills from his wife's illness, had pushed the operation to bankruptcy, but James had clung to the property itself, believing his skills could transform the struggling farm into a sustainable homestead his family could be proud of again. Now, just 5 months after selling off most of their livestock to pay creditors, they faced losing everything. The economic downturn had hit rural Pennsylvania hard. Farm foreclosures had skyrocketed, leaving families like the Richardsons with few options and even fewer resources. James had cobbled together odd jobs at neighboring farms that barely covered their minimal expenses, and his son's part-time work at the local grocery store helped with utilities and food. Their modest savings had been depleted by the medical bills and funeral expenses. The final blow came when their insurance company had denied their claim for the flood damage, citing an exclusion for groundwater infiltration in the policy's fine print. The $12,000 needed for professional remediation might as well have been $12 million. It was equally out of reach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Dad, this pump isn't powerful enough," called out his teenage son, Noah, who stood waist-deep in the flooded cellar, trying to position a borrowed pump that seemed woefully inadequate for the task. The motor whined with effort, but the water level barely seemed to move. "We need something industrial grade, and we need to find where all this water is coming from." Noah was a good kid, 17 years old, with the kind of determined intelligence that reminded James of his own father. Despite being on spring break, he'd volunteered to help rather than spending time with friends. His younger sister, Emma, was staying with James's brother while they fought to save their home. James looked around the cellar that had once held so much potential. The water was murky and filled with the debris of their accumulated belongings. Family photos documenting 5 generations of Richardsons bobbed next to Christmas decorations they'd carefully stored. Farm equipment that James had meticulously maintained over the years floated like shipwreck artifacts. The water had likely ruined the furnace and electrical system, creating yet another financial burden they couldn't afford. "Noah, we can't afford an industrial pump," James replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "The rental on this one is already $65 a day that we don't have. We can't get the water out fast enough. I'm afraid we're going to lose the farm." He'd done the math obsessively over the past 5 days. The borrowed pump was already stretching their emergency credit card to the limit. The estimate for professional flood remediation was $12,000, more than their remaining credit and available cash combined. The electrical work needed to bring the cellar up to code would cost at least $8,000 more. Even if they could somehow afford the immediate repairs, they'd still need to address the crumbling foundation, the aging plumbing, and a dozen other maintenance issues that had been accumulating since his grandfather's death 10 years ago. The farm at 1776 Liberty Road had been built during the tumultuous pre-Civil War era when Pennsylvania was a key station on the Underground Railroad. Originally owned by the Thornton family, abolitionists who had prospered in the iron industry, the house had passed to the Richardson family in 1889 when James's great-great-grandfather purchased it at auction. The property had been in their family ever since, passing from father to son through generations of farmers who had weathered economic depressions, droughts, and changing agricultural markets. James had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about the farm's history, including rumors that it had once served as a stop on the Underground Railroad, though no physical evidence had ever been found to support those family legends. The county was changing rapidly. What had once been a thriving agricultural region was being discovered by developers who saw potential for suburban housing developments and commercial properties. 3 farms within 5 miles had been purchased by investment companies in the past year, demolished to make way for tract housing that promised tax revenue for the struggling county. James had watched the transformation with a mixture of sadness and anxiety about rising property taxes that would further strain his budget. The only thing keeping developers from his door had been the historic designation of the main farmhouse, a protection that wouldn't matter if the county condemned the property for safety violations. "Dad, there might be assistance programs for flood victims," Noah suggested hopefully. "Maybe the county has resources we don't know about." James shook his head, having already explored every available option with the thoroughness of someone fighting for survival. "I've called everyone, Noah. FEMA says this doesn't qualify as a federal disaster because it's not widespread enough. The county says their emergency funds are exhausted from the bridge collapse last month. The Red Cross can provide temporary shelter, but not property repairs. And our insurance." He gestured helplessly at the water surrounding them. "Apparently, this kind of flooding isn't covered under our policy." The insurance situation was particularly infuriating. James had carefully reviewed their homeowner's policy after his wife's death, ensuring they had what seemed like adequate coverage, but the fine print contained exclusions that he hadn't fully understood. The policy covered flooding from natural disasters, but specifically excluded flooding caused by groundwater, infiltration, or municipal infrastructure failure. The drainage system collapse was considered an act of local government rather than a natural disaster, creating a legal loophole that left them without coverage for exactly the kind of catastrophe they faced. James had spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, explaining their situation to representatives who seemed sympathetic but powerless to help. The claims adjuster who'd visited had been apologetic but firm. Municipal infrastructure failures were explicitly excluded under standard homeowners' policies. If James wanted that kind of protection, he would have needed separate flood insurance, which cost hundreds of dollars annually and had a 30-day waiting period before taking effect, money and time they simply hadn't had. "The county inspector is coming back tomorrow morning," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "If this cellar isn't dry and the structural damage isn't addressed, they'll condemn the property. After that, we're looking at seizure and auction." He'd met the inspector twice already. A tired-looking woman named Patricia Jenkins, who'd been doing this job for 12 years and had seen every kind of rural property disaster Chester County could produce. Jenkins had been professional but clear about the stakes. The county couldn't allow families to live in houses with compromised foundations and ongoing flooding. If they couldn't resolve the problems within the specified time frame, the house would be declared uninhabitable and scheduled for seizure. The prospect of seizure was almost worse than bankruptcy. At least with bankruptcy, the property might be sold to someone who could afford to restore it. With condemnation and seizure, the family would lose their ancestral home and still be responsible for outstanding debts. The loss would follow them for years, making it nearly impossible to find another place to live. Noah stopped working with the pump and looked at his father with the kind of maturity that children sometimes display in times of crisis. "Dad, there has to be something we can do. This farm probably has history. Maybe there's something special about it that could help us save it." James appreciated his optimism, but he understood the harsh realities of rural property management better than a teenager could. Chester County was dealing with aging infrastructure throughout its historic communities, struggling with limited budgets and an overwhelming number of problems. Condemning flood-damaged properties was often easier and cheaper than helping owners navigate complex restoration processes, especially when those owners lacked financial resources to hire lawyers or advocates. "I've been noticing something strange about this cellar," Noah continued, unwilling to give up. "The back wall looks different from the others. See how that section bulges outward? That's not typical for houses from this era." James had noticed these oddities himself during their years of ownership. He'd often remarked that the stone walls seemed too elaborate for a rural foundation, pointing out details in the masonry that suggested professional construction techniques from another era. "Different how?" James asked, finding himself curious despite their dire circumstances. "The cellar is too deep for a house built in the 1850s, and that back wall, it's different stonework from the rest of the foundation. I've been researching Chester County's history for my school project, and this area was a hotbed of underground rail activity before the Civil War. There were documented stations all through this region." The theory wasn't entirely far-fetched. Their region had been known for strong abolitionist sentiments before and during the Civil War, with numerous documented stops on the Underground Railroad scattered throughout the area. Many rural properties had been developed on land that had previously housed secret rooms or hidden passages to conceal escaped slaves on their journey north to freedom. James had noticed some unusual features in the cellar's construction himself. The stone walls were built with a precision typically found in more important buildings, using carefully fitted limestone blocks rather than the rough fieldstone common in rural foundations of the era. The ceiling was unusually high, nearly 9 feet, and the floor had been laid with thick flagstones that suggested the space had been designed for heavy use. "You might be right about the construction," James acknowledged, finding himself examining the cellar walls with renewed interest. "But even if this place has historical significance, that doesn't solve our immediate problem. We need dry floors and sound structure, not historical curiosities." Even as he said it, James found himself looking more carefully at the cellar construction. The water level had dropped slightly since they'd started pumping, revealing stone walls that did seem unusually sophisticated for a rural foundation. The stonework was precise and professional, with carefully fitted joints and what appeared to be iron reinforcement rods set into the mortar at regular intervals. "Maybe we should focus on getting this water out first, then worry about historical mysteries," he said, trying to redirect Noah's attention to their practical challenges, while simultaneously wondering if his theories might somehow be relevant to their current crisis. They worked in silence for the next hour, taking turns operating the pump and hauling buckets of water up the cellar stairs. The work was exhausting and seemingly endless. For every bucket they removed, more water seemed to seep in from somewhere, not enough to raise the level significantly, but enough to make their progress frustratingly slow. James's back ached from the constant lifting and carrying, and his hands were raw from gripping the bucket handles. The cellar held generations of family life, and watching their possessions float in the murky water was heartbreaking. He saw Noah's 4-H trophies bobbing near the stairs, Emma's collection of stuffed animals floating past, and the Christmas decorations they'd carefully stored after celebrating their first holiday without Marie, most painful with the family. Photographs albums chronicling 5 generations of Richardsons on this land, likely ruined beyond salvage. His great-grandfather standing proudly beside the first tractor the farm had owned. His grandfather teaching the young James to milk cows. James and Marie on their wedding day, standing beneath the ancient oak tree that still stood sentinel over the property. As the afternoon light began to fade, James realized they'd made minimal progress. The water level had dropped perhaps 6 inches, but the cellar was still largely flooded, and the structural damage remained untreated. The foundation, electrical system, and support beams were all compromised, creating safety hazards that would need to be addressed before the house could be considered habitable again. With less than 60 hours remaining until the county's deadline, James was beginning to accept that the farm his family had owned for over a century was about to be lost forever. The arithmetic was brutal and unavoidable. He simply didn't have the money to hire professional water removal services, replace the damaged structures, and address all the other issues required to satisfy the county's requirements. As darkness fell outside, James's best friend Michael arrived with hot meals and fresh coffee, his face showing concern but his eyes still holding a determined spark. He'd been helping whenever he could, bringing supplies and moral support while James and Noah fought what seemed like a losing battle. "Any progress?" he asked, setting down the food containers and the thermos of coffee. "Not enough," James replied honestly. "The pump is too small, and the water keeps coming in. We're fighting a losing battle." Michael kicked off his shoes and rolled up his pants, preparing to join them in the flooded cellar. Despite having worked a full shift at the county's public works department, his dedication to James's family had never wavered. Even when Marie was sick and their financial situation became precarious, Michael had been there with practical help and unwavering friendship. "We're not giving up," he said firmly. "This is your home, your family's legacy, and we're going to fight for it until the very last minute." As Michael descended the cellar stairs, Noah called out from the far corner where he'd been working. "Dad, Michael, I think there's something you need to see." He was standing near the rear wall of the cellar, where the receding water had revealed what appeared to be a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the cellar. The stone pattern was different, where most of the wall was laid with uniform limestone blocks. This section showed a rectangular outline of different stones fitted together in a way that suggested they could be moved. James waded over to where Noah was standing, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The rectangular outline was clearly artificial, about 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, with stones that were noticeably different from the surrounding foundation. The joints around the rectangle were filled with a different type of mortar, suggesting that this section had been installed or modified separately from the original construction. "Noah was right," he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder and growing excitement. "There is something unusual about this cellar." Noah ran his hands along the edges of the rectangular outline. "Dad, this looks like some kind of doorway or access panel. Do you think there could be a room or passage behind it?" James's mind raced with possibilities. If Noah was right about their cellar having been part of an underground railroad station before the Civil War, this rectangular outline might be evidence of that earlier purpose. Could there be a hidden space behind their foundation? Perhaps a storage room or tunnel from whatever abolitionist operation had occupied the site during the 1850s, but he also understood that discovering hidden rooms in their cellar wouldn't solve the immediate problem of flood damage and structural hazards. Whatever was behind those stones had been there for decades, possibly over 160 years. It would still be there after the county condemned their property and scheduled it for seizure. "Noah, even if there's something down there, I don't see how it helps us," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Despite his practical concerns, he found himself hoping that whatever lay behind the mysterious stones might somehow provide the miracle they desperately needed. "Dad, what if it's something valuable or historically important?" Noah persisted, his teenage optimism undimmed by their dire circumstances. "What if it's something that can help us save the farm?" Michael joined them at the rectangular outline, his eyes widening as he examined the stonework. "This definitely looks intentional," he whispered, a smile briefly lighting his tired face. "The construction is too precise to be accidental." James looked at the mysterious rectangular outline in his cellar wall, then at the condemnation notice that would make his family homeless in less than 60 hours. The flooding crisis that had seemed like an insurmountable disaster was suddenly charged with unexpected possibility. And with time running out before the county's final inspection, whatever was hidden behind their cellar wall might be their last hope. The failing farm that had seemed like an overwhelming burden was about to reveal secrets that would change everything. James thought he knew about his home, his family's history, and the hidden legacy that had been beneath their feet for generations. James's hands trembled as he reached for a crowbar, knowing that whatever they discovered next would either save his family's future or confirm that they had lost everything. James's hands trembled as he and Noah worked to clear the remaining water from around the mysterious, rectangular outline in their cellar wall. The April evening had settled in completely now, and the single work light they had brought cast eerie shadows across the stone walls that his son had insisted held secrets. What they were about to uncover would either vindicate Noah's theories about their home's hidden history or prove to be another heartbreaking dead end in their desperate fight to save the farm. "Dad, these stones definitely move," Noah said, his voice tight with excitement and effort as he worked his fingers around the edges of the rectangular section. "Look, this whole section is separate from the rest of the wall. It's like it was designed to be opened." The stones that formed the rectangular outline were indeed different from the surrounding cellar wall. Where the regular foundation used uniform limestone blocks laid in a standard pattern, this section consisted of carefully cut granite blocks fitted together with precision that spoke of professional construction. The mortar around the edges was a different color and texture, suggesting it had been installed or modified at a different time than the original foundation. James knelt beside Noah in the shallow water that remained, running his fingers along the joints between the stones. His son had been right about so many things regarding their home's construction, and now he was beginning to understand why Noah had spent so many evenings down here, measuring walls and examining stonework with the intensity of a young detective. The evidence had been here all along, hidden beneath years of stored farm equipment and family belongings. "Noah was right about the construction," he murmured, more to himself than to Michael. "He kept suggesting our farm might have been connected to the Underground Railroad, but I never took him seriously." The theory had seemed like one of Noah's harmless obsessions, the kind of historical speculation that history enthusiasts love to pursue, but that had little bearing on practical daily life. James had always been focused on more immediate concerns, keeping the farm operational, paying medical bills, and later dealing with the flooding crisis. He'd never had time for theories about 1850s, construction techniques, or the abolitionist history of their region. But now, faced with the loss of everything they'd built together, James found himself desperately hoping that Noah's theories might somehow provide the salvation they needed. If the farm did indeed have hidden rooms or tunnels from the pre-Civil War era, there might be preservation programs or heritage designations that could protect it from condemnation and seizure. "How do we get these stones out?" Noah asked, examining the tight joints between the granite blocks. James looked around the cellar for tools that might help with their investigation. Most of his equipment was either submerged or damaged by the flooding, but he spotted his old crowbar hanging on a pegboard that had remained above the waterline. "Let's try this," he said, retrieving the crowbar. "But be careful. If there's really something behind here, we don't want to damage it." James positioned the crowbar along the edge of one of the granite blocks, working carefully to avoid scarring the stone or damaging whatever might lie behind. The first block resisted his efforts, held in place by decades of settled mortar and the weight of the surrounding stones. "It's moving," James said, his voice strained with effort. "I can feel it starting to loosen." The first stone came free with a grinding sound that echoed through the cellar like a door opening after decades of disuse. Behind the granite block was darkness that seemed to extend further back than any of them had expected. James shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing what appeared to be a carefully constructed passageway behind their cellar wall. "Noah, there's definitely a tunnel back there," James said, his voice hushed with amazement. "And it looks dry, completely protected from the flooding." Noah's eyes widened as he peered into the opening his father had created. "Dad, this is incredible. We have to get more stones out to see where it leads." Michael stood transfixed at the sight of the opening in their cellar wall. "I can't believe it," he whispered. Noah was right all along. They worked feverishly to remove more of the granite blocks, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the desperate hope that whatever lay hidden behind their cellar wall might somehow help with their dire situation. Each stone they removed revealed more of the passageway, and with each revelation, it became clear that Noah had been absolutely right about their home's unusual history. The tunnel was approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, with arched brick construction that demonstrated professional techniques. The space had been carefully waterproofed and appeared to have remained dry despite the flooding in the main cellar. The floor was paved with worn but intact wooden planks, creating a path that led away from the opening into darkness. "This is an underground railroad tunnel," Michael gasped, his voice filled with awe. "An actual pre-Civil War freedom passage." The tunnel was indeed reminiscent of the hidden passages that had been discovered in other parts of Pennsylvania, remnants of the extensive network that had supported the Quaker abolitionist movement and helped thousands of escaped slaves reach freedom. But this discovery raised immediate questions that none of them could answer. Where did the tunnel lead? When had it been sealed off, and why? And perhaps most importantly, could this historical find somehow help them save their home? "This is incredible," James said, though the evidence before his eyes made denial difficult. "How did an entire tunnel system remain hidden in our cellar all this time? And why wasn't it in any of the property records?" Noah was already climbing into the tunnel, his teenage fearlessness overcoming any concerns about the safety or wisdom of exploring the hidden passage. "Dad, Michael, you need to see this," he called back, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "There's writing on the walls, and the tunnel keeps going." James's practical caution warred with his growing excitement about what they'd discovered. The tunnel had clearly been sealed for decades, possibly since the end of the Civil War, and there was no immediate danger in exploring it. But he also understood that whatever they found down there would complicate their already desperate situation with the county authorities. "Be careful, Noah," he called as he followed him into the tunnel, Michael close behind. "We don't know how stable any of this is." The passage felt remarkably dry and well-preserved considering its age, and the flooding that had affected the main cellar. The walls showed evidence of careful waterproofing, with what appeared to be tar or pitch applied to the brick surfaces to prevent moisture infiltration. The wooden floor was worn but solid, creating a stable surface that had clearly been designed for frequent use. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, James's flashlight beam revealed faded writing on the walls. Names, dates, and what appeared to be coded messages had been chalked onto the brick surface. Most had faded to near illegibility, but a few remained clear enough to read. April 15, 1858. 4 souls to freedom. James read aloud, tracing the faded chalk marks with his fingertips. June 3, 1859. God's blessing on 7 more. Noah had moved further ahead, his excitement propelling him deeper into the tunnel. "Dad, it opens up into a bigger room ahead," he called back. "And there's something else here." James and Michael followed, their flashlight beams crisscrossing in the darkness as they approached what appeared to be a larger chamber. As they entered the space, their lights revealed a scene that seemed frozen in time, a large underground room, approximately 15 feet square, with brick walls and a dirt floor. The chamber was filled with wooden shelving, most of which had collapsed with age, and the remnants of what appeared to be a small-scale living area. Rotted blankets, rusted metal containers, and clay vessels lay scattered across the floor, covered in decades of dust but remarkably intact. In one corner stood what appeared to be a large iron chest, its dark metal surface contrasting with the lighter brick of the walls. "This was a hiding place for fugitive slaves," Michael observed, his knowledge of Pennsylvania history coming to the fore. "They probably waited here until it was safe to move them further north toward Canada." James approached the iron chest with growing amazement and apprehension. The discovery of an underground railroad station had been surprising enough, but finding an intact chest raised questions that went far beyond architectural curiosities. This was clearly something that had been deliberately hidden, preserved with the same care and attention that had gone into constructing the tunnel itself. "Noah, look at this," he said, examining the area around the chest more carefully. The metal door was marked with faded lettering that had once identified its ownership. James could make out partial words that appeared to spell Thornton Brothers and what looked like an abolitionist emblem, though the paint was too faded to read completely. "The Thorntons were prominent abolitionists in Chester County," Noah said, his eyes wide with excitement. "We learned about them in history class. They operated iron foundries and were known to be staunch anti-slavery activists before and during the Civil War." James examined the chest more closely. The locking mechanism was sophisticated for its era, combination lock surrounded by smaller keyholes and auxiliary locking points. Despite its age, the mechanism appeared remarkably well preserved, though he had no idea whether it could still be operated after being sealed away for so long. "I don't know if we can open it without the combination," he said, studying the intricate locking system. These old safes were designed to be virtually impenetrable without the correct sequence. Michael had moved to examine the area around the chest more carefully. "James, look at this," he said, pointing to a small metal plate affixed to the wall beside the chest. The plate appeared to contain numbers and letters arranged in what might be a code or instruction. "R23, L17, R44, L38, Michael read aloud. Could this be the combination? James's heart raced as he considered the possibility. If the plate did indeed contain the combination to the chest, then whatever had been stored inside might still be accessible. But he also understood that opening the chest would cross a threshold from discovering historical architecture to actively engaging with whatever had been hidden by Pennsylvania's abolitionists over a century and a half ago. "Should we try it?" he asked, looking to Michael for guidance. As always in their friendship, Michael's adventurous spirit balanced James's practical caution, creating a partnership that had weathered numerous challenges. "James, this could be important, not just for you, but for understanding the history of this region and maybe even the nation," Michael replied. "I think we have to try." With trembling hands, James approached the chest's combination lock. The mechanism was stiff from decades of disuse, but it moved when he applied steady pressure. Following the sequence on the metal plate, he turned the dial right to 23, then left to 17, then right to 44, and finally left to 38. As he completed the sequence, they heard a distinct clicking sound from within the door's mechanism. James held his breath as he grasped the large iron handle and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of metal that had remained stationary for over 160 years, the chest door began to move. The hinges protested but functioned, allowing the heavy door to swing outward into the chamber. As it opened, the beam of James's flashlight revealed a space beyond, filled with objects that gleamed in the artificial light. "Oh my God," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's still here. After all this time, it's still here." The chest contained several leather-bound journals, what appeared to be hand-drawn maps, and a collection of documents wrapped in oilcloth for preservation. But most striking were the wooden boxes arranged on the lower shelves, each marked with faded, but still visible printing that read Thornton Iron Works, 1861. Noah stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. "Dad, Michael, are those money boxes?" "They look like it." "They do," James confirmed, his voice tight with disbelief. "Actual Civil War-era abolitionist funds." The implications were staggering. If the wooden boxes contained what their markings suggested, then what they'd discovered wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was evidence of what might have been one of the largest underground railroad operations in Pennsylvania's abolitionist history. James carefully lifted one of the wooden boxes, testing its weight. "This is heavy," he said, his voice hushed with awe. I think these might actually contain money or valuables." With utmost care, James opened the clasp that had kept the box sealed for nearly a century and a half. As he opened it, they all gasped at the contents. Gold coin stacks of them, each carefully wrapped in oilcloth and labeled with dates, ranging from 1858 to 1863. "These are all gold coins," James said, his voice hushed with awe. "From before and during the Civil War, each one might be worth far more than face value to collectors today." James's agricultural background had taught him enough about historical artifacts to understand the implications. Old currency, especially gold from significant historical periods like the Civil War, often commanded premiums far beyond face value from collectors and museums. These weren't just old coins, they were tangible connections to one of America's most courageous eras of moral courage and sacrifice. "There must be dozens of boxes," Noah whispered, counting the wooden containers visible in the chest. "Dad, what does this mean? Why would all this be hidden under our farm?" James's mind raced with possibilities. The dates on the coin wrappers, spanning from 1858 to 1863, coincided with the height of underground railroad activity and the early years of the Civil War. This could have been funding for the entire regional network. "This could be connected to the Civil War," he said, recalling their previous conversations about Pennsylvania's history. The Thorntons were under pressure from both Southern sympathizers and federal authorities who were trying to appease the South before the war. They might have hidden their abolitionist funds to protect them during the conflict. "You think this is actual Underground Railroad funding?" Michael asked, the excitement in his voice tinged with concern. "It would have been," James clarified, examining one of the leather-bound journals he'd retrieved from a shelf. "This looks like a detailed accounting of their operation. Safe houses, conductor payments, provisions for escaping slaves. It's all here." This is basically the complete financial record of a major pre-Civil War underground railroad station. James carefully examined one of the gold coins, feeling its weight and texture. The discovery represented both tremendous opportunity and serious ethical questions. If these assets had indeed been hidden by abolitionists during the Civil War era, who did they legally belong to now? Did James and his family have any claim to treasure found on their own property? And perhaps most importantly, could they use this discovery to save their farm without getting themselves into legal trouble? As James was contemplating these questions, Noah had moved to examine the documents wrapped in oilcloth. "Dad, Michael, you need to see these," he said, carefully unfolding papers that had been preserved for nearly 2 centuries. The documents appeared to be letters and business agreements between the Thornton brothers and various associates. As James read through them, his eyes widened with understanding. "These aren't just records of underground railroad activities," he said with growing excitement. "They document the brothers' attempts to finance the abolitionist movement through legitimate businesses. Listen to this. In recognition of the moral imperative before us and the increasing hostility from those who would maintain the institution of slavery, the Brotherhood resolves to establish legitimate holdings in land and manufacturing that can withstand scrutiny and provide for our cause should current ventures become untenable." The letter was signed by William Thornton and dated March 1861, just weeks before the first shots of the Civil War would be fired at Fort Sumter. They were creating a financial network to support the abolitionist cause, James realized. And they were hiding their money not just from Southern sympathizers, but from a federal government that was still trying to appease slave states before the war broke out. "And look at this," James continued, examining another document. "Property deeds for several buildings in this region, including this farm. The Thorntons actually owned this property, but through a front company called Liberty Valley Agricultural Holdings. That explains why the historical records didn't show any connection to them." James carefully replaced the gold coin in its wooden box, understanding that their discovery represented far more than a potential financial windfall. It was a physical connection to a tumultuous period in American history when moral courage had created a network of resistance against the institution of slavery, making ordinary citizens into heroes while government officials struggled with compromise and appeasement. "What do we do now?" Noah asked, the question hanging in the air between them. James looked around the underground chamber that had protected its secrets for over a century and a half, at the money boxes and historical documents that might represent their family's financial salvation or a legal nightmare, and at the condemnation notice that still threatened to make them homeless in less than 48 hours. "First, we document everything," he said, the practical farmer in him asserting itself. "We photograph the tunnel, the money, the documents, everything exactly as we found it. Then we need expert advice before we do anything else." The underground chamber that had hidden its secrets for over 160 years was about to test whether James and his family had the wisdom to handle discoveries that came with both tremendous opportunities and serious responsibilities. The flooding crisis that had threatened to destroy their home had revealed something far more valuable than architectural curiosities: a direct connection to history and potentially the resources to secure their future. As they carefully cataloged the contents of the chest, James understood that the next 48 hours would determine not just whether they could save their farm, but whether they could honor the historical significance of what they had discovered while also protecting their family's future. The weight of the decision pressed on his shoulders as heavily as the condemnation notice had just hours before. But now there was a glimmer of hope where there had been only despair. "Dad," Noah said softly as they worked to document their discovery, "I know this is a lot, but I think we found this for a reason. Maybe this farm chose us because we'd appreciate its history, not just see it as another property to develop." James smiled at his son's perspective, So different from his own practical approach, yet somehow perfectly complementary. Where he saw structural challenges and historical construction techniques, Noah saw stories and connections to the past that gave their home meaning beyond its physical dimensions. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time since the flooding began, James felt something beyond desperation. The farm that had seemed like an overwhelming burden had revealed secrets that connected them to Pennsylvania's complex history, offering not just potential financial salvation, but a purpose that transcended their immediate crisis. Whatever came next, they would face it with a newfound understanding of the legacy they had inherited, along with their troubled family farm. James barely slept that night, his mind racing with the implications of what they had discovered in the underground chamber. The April wind rattled the windows of their old farmhouse as he sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by photographs they'd taken of the tunnel contents, trying to piece together a story that had been hidden for over 160 years. With less than 36 hours remaining before the county's final inspection, he needed to understand not just what they'd found, but what it meant for his family's future and his own moral obligations. The documents spread across the kitchen table told a complex story of courage, sacrifice, and moral conviction that resonated deeply with James's current crisis. The ledgers and letters from the Thornton brothers weren't just historical artifacts. They were a window into the lives of principled Americans who had risked everything during the pre-Civil War era to uphold their moral convictions against slavery, using their resources and privilege to help others achieve freedom, often at great personal risk. James found himself studying the detailed accounting records, understanding that each entry represented both illegal activity under the Fugitive Slave Act and the economic reality of an era when government policies had created a moral crisis that ordinary citizens felt compelled to resist. April 1860. Provisions for 7 souls from Maryland, $37. Payment to conductor. Williams for safe passage, $50. Medical supplies for injured man, $15. The list went on for pages, representing the complex operation that had once thrived beneath the surface of respectable Pennsylvania society during one of the most morally challenging periods in the nation's history. These weren't just clandestine transactions, they represented a parallel system of compassion that had employed dozens of brave individuals during an era when doing the right thing meant breaking unjust laws. The parallels to his family's current situation were striking. Ordinary people caught in circumstances beyond their control, their security threatened by larger forces they couldn't influence, yet finding the courage to persist despite overwhelming odds. But it was the broader historical context that truly made James understand the significance of their discovery. The late 1850s had been a period of unprecedented moral conflict in American society, with tensions between North and South reaching a breaking point. The Fugitive Slave Act had turned Northern citizens into potential accomplices in the return of escaped slaves, forcing many to choose between following unjust laws and obeying their conscience. James had spent hours the previous evening researching this historical period online, trying to understand the context that had led to the creation of the hidden tunnel beneath their home. What he'd learned had transformed his understanding of the discovery from a simple treasure story into something far more complex and morally significant. The Thornton brothers mentioned in the ledgers appeared to have been 3 Quaker entrepreneurs who had built an iron manufacturing business in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Their operation had been remarkably sophisticated, with multiple foundries, a distribution network that extended across the Northeast, and a system of contributions that supported a vast network of underground railroad stations throughout the region. According to the documents they'd found, the brothers had begun to recognize the precarious nature of their abolitionist activities by early 1860, as tensions between North and South escalated and Southern sympathizers became more aggressive in pursuing escaped slaves. The risks of discovery increased dramatically. The federal government's attempts to appease Southern interests made their activities even more dangerous. With increased enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, threatening severe penalties for those caught aiding escapees. The Thorntons' response, detailed in meeting minutes dated January 1861, had been a strategic initiative to protect their abolitionist network, while maintaining their dangerous but morally necessary Underground Railroad operation. They had begun hiding resources in secure locations, developing coded communications, and creating legal fronts for their activities that could withstand scrutiny from hostile authorities. The tunnel and chest had been part of this strategy. The property at 1776 Liberty Road had been purchased through a front company, providing a secure location to store resources and important documents away from their known business addresses. The tunnel had likely connected to another building, or perhaps even a stream or riverbank, allowing for discreet movement of escaped slaves during a time when Southern slave catchers made open assistance increasingly dangerous. But something had clearly prevented them from retrieving their hidden assets. Historical records indicated that the youngest Thornton brother had been killed during the early days of the Civil War, while the others had redirected their efforts to supporting the Union Army once war broke out. The survivors had likely forgotten or been unable to retrieve the assets hidden in the tunnel, a time capsule of moral courage, preserved in nearly perfect condition for over 160 years. As the morning light began to filter through the kitchen windows, James realized that he needed expert advice to navigate the complex legal, historical, and ethical questions raised by their discovery. The county deadline was approaching rapidly, and he couldn't afford to make decisions based on incomplete information or emotional impulses. "You haven't slept," Michael observed, entering the kitchen, still wearing his work clothes from his overnight shift at the Public Works Department. He had returned as promised to help James continue dealing with their extraordinary situation. "How could I?" James replied with a tired smile. "We've got Civil War-era gold coins in our cellar, a hidden Underground Railroad tunnel that was never supposed to be found, and less than 36 hours to save our farm from condemnation." "I've been thinking," Michael said, pouring coffee for both of them. "We need to talk to Dr. Harrison at Chester County Historical Society. She's an expert on the Underground Railroad and might be able to help us understand the legal implications of what we found." James nodded in agreement. "And we should probably consult a lawyer who specializes in property rights and historical artifacts. This isn't just about finding treasure. It's about doing the right thing with something that has historical significance beyond our family." They decided to reach out to Dr. Eleanor Harrison, a prominent historian who had written extensively about Pennsylvania's role in the Underground Railroad, and Catherine Winters, an attorney who specialized in cultural heritage law and had handled several cases involving historical artifacts found on private property. If anyone could help them understand the significance of their discovery and navigate its legal complexities, it would be these experts. As Michael made the calls, James descended to the cellar to check on the water level and the tunnel entrance. The borrowed pump had continued working through the night, and to his relief, the flooding had receded significantly. The structural damage was still concerning, but the immediate threat of rising water had diminished. The entrance to the underground tunnel remained secure, visible only to someone who knew exactly what to look for among the stone patterns of the cellar wall. Noah joined him in the cellar, his eyes bright despite the early hour. Like his father, he had slept little, the excitement of their discovery keeping his mind racing with possibilities. "Dad, I've been researching the Thorntons for my history project," he said, his voice animated with the thrill of connection. "The textbooks never mentioned anything about them hiding resources or having a station this large. This could change how people understand the entire Underground Railroad network in Pennsylvania." James was struck by his son's perspective. While he had been focused primarily on the immediate practical implications of their discovery, whether it could help them save their farm, Noah had immediately grasped its broader historical significance. His enthusiasm reminded James that what they had found wasn't just potentially valuable in monetary terms. It was a piece of forgotten history that deserved to be understood and preserved. "You're right, Noah," he acknowledged. "This isn't just about us and our farm. It's about understanding a pivotal moment in American history when ordinary citizens chose to follow their conscience rather than unjust laws. It's about people who risked everything to help others achieve freedom." By mid-morning, both Dr. Harrison and Attorney Winters had agreed to visit the farm immediately. Recognizing the urgency of James's situation with the county inspection scheduled for the following day, they had rearranged their schedules to give him precious little time to determine how to proceed. Dr. Eleanor Harrison arrived first. A distinguished woman in her 60s with an energetic manner and an air of contained excitement that became palpable when James showed her the entrance to the underground tunnel. As a historian specializing in the Underground Railroad, she immediately grasped the significance of what they had discovered. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Harrison breathed as she examined the tunnel and the chest with its Thornton markings. "I've studied the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania for 30 years, and there have always been rumors about major resources that were never recovered. But to find actual physical evidence preserved in this condition..." The historian carefully documented everything, photographing the tunnel, the coins, and especially the documents left by the brothers. Her expertise allowed her to place their discovery in its proper historical context, confirming much of what James had pieced together from his own research. The Thorntons were indeed central figures in Chester County's abolitionist movement, Dr. Harrison explained, examining the letters with gloved hands. But these documents suggest something quite different from the common narrative that they were simply wealthy patrons of the cause. They were deeply involved in the day-to-day operations, taking enormous personal risks to help people escape to freedom. The parallels to modern moral struggles were striking. Dr. Harrison explained how the pre-Civil War era had featured many of the same elements as contemporary society debates about federal versus local authority, cultural conflicts between different value systems, and the complex relationship between legal frameworks and moral imperatives. What the Thornton brothers did was clearly illegal under the laws of their time, the historian continued. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 imposed harsh penalties on anyone who aided escaped slaves. But their intentions, according to these documents, were driven by a moral conviction that transcended legal considerations. They were willing to risk everything for what they believed was right. Catherine Winters arrived as Dr. Harrison was completing her initial assessment. The attorney was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had built her practice around the intersection of property law and cultural heritage. After viewing the underground tunnel and its contents, she gathered everyone in the living room to discuss the legal implications of their discovery. "The legal situation here is complex," Winters explained, "but not necessarily as dire as you might fear. There are several principles at work that could actually work in your favor." She outlined how the doctrine of treasure trove might apply to their situation, the legal principle that treasures found hidden on private property, with no clear owner to claim them, may belong to the finder or the property owner, depending on specific circumstances. The fact that these assets have been hidden for over 160 years works in your favor, Winters continued. The Thornton brothers are long deceased, their business entities dissolved, and any direct claims of ownership extremely difficult to establish. Additionally, statutes of limitations on any violations of the Fugitive Slave Act expired long ago, meaning there's no legal liability to consider. However, Winters emphasized that the historical and cultural significance of the discovery created both opportunities and obligations that went beyond strict legal requirements. "This isn't just currency, it's a historical archive that documents a pivotal chapter in American history. That creates certain ethical considerations that go beyond strict legal requirements." The attorney suggested a balanced approach, one that would respect the historical significance of the find while also acknowledging James's rights as the property owner who had discovered the tunnel. The gold itself has significant value both as face value and as historical artifacts, but the documents may be even more valuable from a historical perspective, she explained. There's a strong case for preserving the historical record while also recognizing your legitimate claim to at least a portion of the financial value. As Dr. Harrison and Attorney Winters continued their assessment, James was startled by a knock at the front door. He opened it to find Patricia Jenkins, the county inspector, standing on his porch a day earlier than scheduled. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her expression professional but not unkind. "I was in the area and thought I'd check on your progress with the remediation. Has the flooding situation improved?" James's heart sank. They weren't prepared for an early inspection, not with experts still examining the underground tunnel and no decisions yet made about how to proceed. But he also recognized an opportunity to potentially gain more time. "Ms. Jenkins, something unexpected has happened," he said carefully. "We've discovered what appears to be a historically significant structure beneath our cellar wall. We have experts here right now assessing it." Jenkins's professional demeanor gave way to surprised curiosity. "What kind of structure?" James invited her in, introducing her to Dr. Harrison and Attorney Winters. The historian quickly explained the significance of what they discovered, her academic credentials lending immediate credibility to the situation. "This is a historically significant find," Dr. Harrison explained. "A previously unknown underground railroad tunnel and chest belonging to the Thornton brothers, with intact documents that could change our understanding of how the abolitionist network operated in this region. It would be a tremendous loss to Pennsylvania's historical record if this property were condemned before proper archaeological documentation could take place." Patricia Jenkins listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. As a county inspector, her primary concern was safety and code compliance, but she was also a lifelong resident of Chester County with respect for the region's rich history. "The flooding and structural damage are the immediate concerns," she said after a moment. "Has that situation improved?" "Significantly," James confirmed, leading her to the cellar to show the progress they'd made. The water level had receded considerably, though the structural issues still needed inspection and likely repair. After examining the cellar and being shown the entrance to the underground tunnel, Jenkins made a decision that gave James precious breathing room. "Given the historical significance of this discovery, I can recommend a 14-day extension on the condemnation notice," she said. "That would give you time for proper assessment and documentation of the historical site. However, you'll still need to address the structural hazards and complete the flood remediation within that time frame." The extension was a reprieve, but not a solution. James still needed funds to complete the necessary repairs, and he had yet to determine how to proceed with the tunnel contents. But the additional time would allow him to make these decisions thoughtfully rather than in a desperate rush. After Jenkins left, Dr. Harrison made a suggestion that caught everyone by surprise. "The Chester County Historical Society has funds for the preservation of significant historical discoveries," she explained. "Given the importance of these documents and artifacts, I believe I could arrange for a preservation grant that would cover the immediate repairs needed to save this property from condemnation." "You could do that?" James asked, hardly daring to hope. "The alternative would be losing access to this historical site completely," Dr. Harrison replied. "From an academic perspective, preserving this discovery is worth far more than the cost of cellar repairs and structural work." Attorney Winters nodded in agreement. "And in terms of the tunnel contents, I would recommend a balanced approach. The historical documents should be preserved in an appropriate academic or museum setting, with the Richardson family credited as the discoverers." "And the gold?" James asked, the question they'd all been considering since the discovery. "That's where we can create a fair compromise," Winters suggested. Some portion should be preserved for historical exhibition alongside the documents. But there's a strong legal case that as the property owner who discovered this treasure, you have rights to a significant portion of the financial value. The prospect of financial relief from their discovery was tempting, but James exchanged a look with Noah that reflected their shared values. Throughout their lives together, he had taught his children that integrity mattered more than money, that doing the right thing sometimes required personal sacrifice. What would be the right thing to do? James asked, voicing the question that had been weighing on his mind since they'd first opened the chest. These assets were obtained to help people escape slavery. Just because that was over 160 years ago, does that change our obligation to honor their original purpose? Dr. Harrison considered the question thoughtfully. The victims of slavery are long gone, as are the Thorntons themselves. But the principles of freedom, equality, and moral courage that drove their actions, those principles remain relevant today. What if, Noah suggested, we used a portion of the value to establish something that honors the Underground Railroad's legacy? Something that helps people today who are fighting for freedom and justice, the way the Thorntons were trying to do back then. The idea resonated with everyone present. A fund that would honor the complex history of the abolitionist movement while addressing contemporary needs would create meaning from their discovery beyond personal gain. By evening, a plan had begun to take shape. The Chester County Historical Society would provide an emergency preservation grant to cover the immediate repairs needed to save James's farm, allowing him to address the flooding damage and structural hazards before the extended deadline. In exchange, the family would provide the society with exclusive access to document and study the underground tunnel and its historical contents. The documents and a representative selection of the gold coins would be preserved in the Society's archives, with plans for a special exhibition that would tell the story of the Thornton brothers and their courageous work on the Underground Railroad during the tumultuous years before the Civil War. The Richardson family would be prominently credited with the discovery, with Noah invited to participate in the historical research as an intern, an opportunity that thrilled the history-loving teenager. As for the remaining gold coins, Attorney Winters would establish a trust that would serve two purposes, providing for the Richardson family's financial security, including funds to fully restore their historic farm, and creating a foundation that would support education about the Underground Railroad and fund contemporary social justice initiatives that embodied the Thornton spirit of moral courage. From Underground Railroad to lifting lives, James read aloud from the mission statement they had drafted for the foundation. I think the Thornton brothers would approve of how we're honoring their legacy. Michael squeezed his shoulder, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of relief, pride, and purpose that James felt. We're not just saving your farm, he said softly. We're continuing what they started, helping people find freedom and dignity, just in the ways needed for our time. Noah looked around the living room of the house that had seemed like such a burden just days before, now transformed into the centerpiece of an unexpected journey through America's complex history. Dad, he said thoughtfully, sometimes the biggest treasures aren't the ones that are hidden, they're the ones that are shared. As James hugged his son, he understood that the flooding crisis that had threatened to destroy their home had instead revealed something far more valuable than wooden boxes of old gold coins, a connection to history, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, including behind the walls of your own cellar. The next 14 days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity that transformed not just James Richardson's farm, but his understanding of his place in Pennsylvania's rich tapestry of history. The Historical Society's preservation grant arrived within 48 hours, providing the immediate funds needed to address the flooding damage and structural hazards that had threatened their home with condemnation. Professional restoration crews worked alongside James, who put his agricultural experience to good use, directing efforts to protect both the historic structure of the house and the underground tunnel that had become the centerpiece of their unexpected journey. Noah threw himself into the project with boundless energy, learning traditional masonry techniques from the restoration specialists and applying his natural attention to detail to the delicate work of preserving the tunnel's historical integrity. By the time Patricia Jenkins returned for her follow-up inspection, the cellar was not only dry, but significantly improved. New support beams had been installed according to code. The foundation had been properly reinforced against future water infiltration, and a custom access point had been created to allow continued study of the underground tunnel while maintaining the structural integrity of the house. "This is remarkable progress, Mr. Richardson," Jenkins said, clearly impressed as she signed off on the inspection form that officially removed the condemnation threat. "Most property owners would have given up when faced with the situation you were in 2 weeks ago." "We had help," James acknowledged, thinking of the unprecedented coalition that had formed around their discovery: historians, legal experts, museum administrators, and county officials who had recognized that some things transcended bureaucratic boundaries. "And we had motivation. This farm isn't just a property to us. It's our family's legacy, and now a piece of living history." The underground tunnel and its contents had indeed proven to be historically significant beyond initial expectations. Dr. Harrison had assembled a team of experts from various disciplines: civil, war historians, archaeologists, document preservation specialists, and numismatists, to properly catalog and analyze everything found in the chamber. The gold alone represented one of the most significant underground railroad discoveries in recent American history. The collection included over 200 gold coins dating from the 1850s and early 1860s, most in remarkably good condition, with several rare specimens that had been previously unknown to collectors. Beyond their considerable metal value, the historical significance of these coins made them even more valuable, with some individual pieces potentially worth thousands to the right institutions or collectors. But it was the documents that generated the most academic excitement. The Thornton brothers' detailed records provided unprecedented insight into the inner workings of underground railroad operations during the pre-Civil War era. Letters between the brothers revealed how they had navigated the complex world of abolitionist activities while simultaneously managing legitimate businesses, a narrative that challenged simplistic portrayals of that era. These men weren't just idealistic abolitionists, Dr. Harrison explained during a presentation at the Chester County Historical Society that the entire Richardson family had been invited to attend. They were sophisticated strategists who understood that moral change required both principled stands and practical organization. They created an entire shadow economy to support freedom at a time when the law demanded complicity with slavery. The historical parallels to modern social justice movements were not lost on anyone. The documents describe the same challenges that continue to face those working for social change: the tension between legal compliance and moral imperatives, the need for both public advocacy and private action, and the complex choices faced by those trying to create a more just society within imperfect systems. Attorney Winters had successfully navigated the complex legal issues surrounding the discovery, crafting an agreement that balanced historical preservation with recognition of the Richardson family's rights as property owners and discoverers. The Chester County Historical Society would receive the complete document archive and a representative selection of coins for permanent preservation and exhibition. In exchange, the Richardson family would retain ownership rights to a portion of the financial value, with provisions for its responsible management. Most significantly, the agreement established the Liberty Pathway Foundation, a non-profit organization funded by a percentage of the discovery's value. The foundation would focus on educational initiatives about the Underground Railroad, historical preservation of related sites, and support for contemporary social justice causes that embodied the same spirit of moral courage shown by the Thornton brothers and other abolitionists. 3 months after their discovery, James stood in the Grand Hall of the Chester County Historical Society, where a special exhibition titled Passages to Freedom, the Thornton Brothers and Pennsylvania's Underground Railroad, was being unveiled to the public. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a life-sized recreation of the underground tunnel, complete with a replica of the chest and interactive displays that told the story of the Underground Railroad and the everyday heroes who had risked everything to help others achieve freedom. "I never imagined we'd be part of something like this," James whispered to Michael as they watched visitors entering the exhibition space. Their names were prominently featured in the exhibition credits, with special recognition for Noah, who had contributed to the historical research as part of his internship with Dr. Harrison's team. "It's surreal," Michael agreed, still finding it difficult to believe how dramatically their circumstances had changed. The farm that had once been on the verge of condemnation was now not only saved, but designated as a historical landmark, providing both protection from future development and significant property tax benefits that made their long-term ownership secure. The partial allocation of the discovered gold, carefully managed by financial advisors arranged through Attorney Winters, had provided enough funds to complete the restoration of their historic property, establish college funds for Noah and Emma, and create a financial cushion that allowed James to focus on sustainable farming practices, rather than taking whatever odd jobs he could find to make ends meet. But it was the establishment of the Liberty Pathway foundation that had given the family the greatest sense of purpose and meaning from their discovery. James had been asked to serve on the foundation's board, bringing his practical experience with rural preservation and historical farmsteads to help guide the organization's work. The foundation had already funded the restoration of 3 other Underground Railroad sites in Pennsylvania, supported educational programs that brought the history of abolition to thousands of school children, and established a scholarship program for students pursuing studies related to civil rights, history, and contemporary social justice. Dr. Harrison approached the family as they toured the exhibition, her academic demeanor giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "The response has been extraordinary," she told them. "We've had interest from Civil War historians across the country. This discovery is changing how we understand the entire abolitionist movement in Pennsylvania." The exhibition included an entire section dedicated to the discovery itself, with photographs showing the flooded cellar that had led the Richardsons to find the hidden tunnel. This narrative thread of a modern farmer struggling against financial hardship and property loss only to discover evidence of similar struggles from over a century earlier had resonated deeply with both academic audiences and the general public. "People connect with your story," Dr. Harrison explained. "It creates a bridge between historical events and contemporary challenges, helping visitors understand that the fight for justice and dignity has always required ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles." Noah had flourished during his time with the Historical Society's research team. His natural curiosity and ability to make connections between historical documents had impressed even seasoned researchers. His work helping decipher damaged letters had earned him special commendation, along with a substantial scholarship that would cover his college expenses when he graduated high school the following year. "Dr. Harrison says I have a natural talent for historical investigation," he told his father proudly. "I never would have discovered this if our cellar hadn't flooded." The discovery had attracted significant media attention, with local television stations and national newspapers all wanting to tell the story of what the Richardson family had found and why it mattered. James had initially been uncomfortable with the spotlight, but soon recognized how sharing their story helped amplify the Foundation's mission by highlighting the continued relevance of moral courage in the face of systemic challenges. Emma, James's 10-year-old daughter, had adapted to the changes with the resilience of childhood. Initially confused by the stream of experts and activities surrounding their home, she had quickly embraced their new role as caretakers of history. With her natural artistic talents, she had even contributed illustrations to the children's section of the museum exhibition, depicting how the Underground Railroad had helped families escape to freedom. At the museum event, County Executive Ramirez approached to speak with them. As someone deeply committed to historical preservation and education, she was particularly interested in the Foundation's work and its connection to Pennsylvania's complex history. "The Richardson family," the county executive said with a smile as she shook James's hand. "Chester County thanks you not just for finding something historic, but for what you chose to do with it." James felt a surge of pride, not because of the praise, but because they had made choices that honored both history and contemporary needs. "We just tried to do the right thing," he said simply. "To respect what we found while using it to help create the kind of world the Thorntons were fighting for." "That's exactly why people connect with your story," Ramirez replied. "In a time when self-interest often dominates, you've shown that historical responsibility and present-day compassion can work together." After the event, they returned to their home on Liberty Road. The farm that once seemed like an overwhelming burden was now a symbol of their journey and a piece of living history. The repairs had been completed with meticulous attention to historical accuracy while incorporating modern improvements and efficiencies. The cellar that had once been filled with murky flood water was now clean and properly reinforced, with a specially designed viewing area where visitors could safely see the entrance to the tunnel while protecting both the home's integrity and the historical site. The Historical Society team continued their research on the tunnel, making new discoveries about its construction and contents that further illuminated the story of the Thornton brothers and their operation. Archaeological excavations had revealed that the tunnel had once connected to a small outbuilding near the stream that bordered their property, creating a complete picture of how the Underground Railroad operation had functioned during the dangerous days of the Fugitive Slave Act. That evening, as the family ate dinner in their newly renovated kitchen, James looked at his children with a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. He saw how much more secure and confident they seemed compared to the dark days of financial struggle before their discovery. Finding what was hidden behind their cellar wall had not only provided financial stability, but had given them a sense of purpose and connection that had strengthened them as a family. The farm that had once been a source of stress and uncertainty had become the center of a meaningful legacy that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. "I've been thinking," Emma said after dinner, "about how lucky we were that our cellar flooded. If it hadn't, we never would have found the tunnel, and we might have lost our farm." James nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange to think that what seemed like our worst problem turned out to be our greatest blessing." Noah, always thoughtful beyond his years, added, "Maybe that's the real lesson in all this. Sometimes what looks like disaster is actually the beginning of something important." The Thorntons probably thought they failed when they couldn't retrieve their resources and the Civil War broke out. But 160 years later, their hidden gold is helping preserve their legacy and continue their work for justice through our foundation. His words resonated deeply with James. Throughout his life, he had viewed challenges as obstacles to be overcome through determination and hard work. But the past 3 months had taught him that sometimes adversity could open doors to possibilities that would otherwise remain hidden. That crisis might be the catalyst for transformation rather than simply a threat to survival. The foundation they had established was growing beyond its initial focus on historical education to include advocacy for rural preservation, support for sustainable farming initiatives, and community development programs in Chester County's evolving communities. What had begun as a way to address their own property crisis was becoming a movement for historical consciousness and social change that honored the complex legacy of the Thornton brothers while transforming their hidden resources into opportunities for today's struggling communities. 6 months after their basement flooded, the Richardsons hosted an open house to showcase their restored farm and raise funds for the foundation. The event featured guided tours of the tunnel entrance area for donors to the educational fund, along with demonstrations of traditional farming techniques that connected visitors to the agricultural history of the region. As James welcomed guests and shared their story, he noticed how many different people found meaning in it: history teachers, eager to bring the Underground Railroad alive for their students; rural preservation advocates fighting to maintain family farms in the face of development pressure; and social justice activists working to address contemporary inequalities. They all connected with the narrative of ordinary people caught in larger economic and social forces, yet finding ways to preserve dignity and build futures based on their deepest values. "Your story gives people hope," said Pastor Williams, whose church worked with the foundation to create educational programs. "Not just because you found treasure, but because you showed that doing the right thing can lead to unexpected blessings, even in the darkest moments." By the end of the event, they had raised enough funding to help restore 2 more historical sites and expand their educational programs into 5 additional school districts, bringing the story of the Underground Railroad and its legacy to thousands more Pennsylvania students. Later that night, after the guests had left and Emma had gone to bed, James and Noah sat on the front porch of their restored farmhouse, looking out over fields that would once again support their family, but now with a deeper purpose than mere subsistence. "I was so scared we would lose everything," James admitted, remembering how desperate he had felt in that flooded cellar with the condemnation notice in his hand. "I couldn't see any way forward. And now we're helping other people find their way forward," Noah said happily. His work with the foundation had given him purpose beyond typical teenage concerns. "From Underground Railroad to lifting lives," James said, quoting the foundation's motto. "We're doing what the Thorntons wanted to do, just in a different time and a better way." Noah nodded, thinking about how help and opportunity flowed through time, from Quaker abolitionists who had risked everything during the pre-Civil War era to his family now helping a new generation understand their heritage and responsibility. Different eras, different challenges, but the same fundamental human desire to build a world of justice and dignity for all. What they had found behind their cellar wall had changed their family's trajectory, turning potential disaster into unexpected blessing. But more importantly, it had connected them to a larger story of courage that extended beyond their personal circumstances. The flood that had nearly cost them their home had instead revealed foundations deeper than their house foundations of moral courage, transformation, and the human capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. As James looked around the farm they had nearly lost and now would keep for generations, he knew the real treasure wasn't the gold or old documents, as valuable as they were. The real treasure was the legacy they had inherited from people they had never met, but whose unfulfilled ambitions for justice and freedom now lived on through the foundation bearing their family name. The flood that had seemed like their worst nightmare had shown them that sometimes help comes from looking deeper, not just behind walls, but into history and human motivation. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had instead connected them to a larger story of moral struggle and aspiration that now continued through their own actions. As darkness settled over their Pennsylvania fields, the Richardsons understood that they had become part of something that transcended their individual lives, a continuing effort to ensure that in times of hardship, communities found ways to support their vulnerable members, creating circles of opportunity and dignity that extended through time like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The Underground Railroad tunnel hidden behind their cellar wall had preserved not just gold and historical documents, but principles that remained as valuable in the 21st century as they had been in the 19th. That Communities thrive when they support their members. That adversity can be the beginning of transformation, and that ordinary individuals acting with conviction can create legacies that continue long after they are gone. The flood had receded, but the legacy would flow forever forward, touching lives far beyond what the Thornton brothers could have imagined when they created their hidden chamber of freedom. And the Richardson family, once on the verge of losing everything, had found something far more valuable than money. They had found their place in a continuing story of courage, resilience, and possibility that would outlast even the gold that had changed their fortunes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.